Okay, perfect.
Yeah, does that work?
Yeah, awesome.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, my name is Lisa Smith Henderson, and Peta Dukes and I did some work together, and it was extraordinary. And this podcast and video grew out of that. And let me just tell you a little bit about Peta. PetaDukesCoaching.co.za. And for those of you in America, that's .co.za. Peta is a certified professional recovery coach, and she works with all kinds of addiction, substance, process. She is trauma informed, which means that she works with CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, addiction, codependency, and the mother wound, and a lot more. And I am just so glad we're getting a chance to talk about this. And today you are going to inform me about CPTSD and what complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Can you explain a little bit about what it is, Peta?
Sure, Lise. Thanks so much for suggesting this and for doing it. It's been long overdue, so I'm really glad that we're doing this. So complex post-traumatic stress disorders kind of starting to gain some recognition in the mainstream. But I first sort of came into relationship with the idea that childhood trauma can affect us right through our lives. About 15, 16 years ago, when I did my training in craniosacral therapy. And we worked a lot with the work of Bessel van der Kolk, Gabor Mate, Stephen Porges, and really I came into relationship with the term complex post-traumatic stress disorder about 6 years ago, and started to realize that it explains so much about me and my own experience of my life. And so what makes post-traumatic stress disorder complex is that the trauma has been ongoing.
So as opposed to
one traumatic event, or veterans come back from war with post-traumatic stress disorder, but complex post-traumatic stress disorder is usually about neglect or abuse that's happened over a long period of time, and usually the earlier in childhood it happens, the closer the person is to you, especially if it's a primary caregiver, the sort of more pronounced the symptoms. And
okay, so it has the same symptoms oftentimes as what we think of as PTSD with veterans of war, but it is maybe manifested much earlier on because the trauma began earlier?
Sure, and earlier, but also it has additional symptoms as well. So your normal post-traumatic stress symptoms of hypervigilance, possible flashbacks to the incident, and that kind of thing. And then as well, more complex symptoms like dissociative symptoms, and those can happen on on a spectrum, and suicidal ideation, addictions, both substance use and process addictions. Process addictions are probably quite indicative of a complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Interesting, more than substance.
Sure. So I mean, we know that we see the substance use disorder in war veterans and that kind of thing. But process addictions usually precede substance use disorder. A lot of people with CPTSD do end up with substance use disorder, but that's a very late symptom. An earlier symptom would be an eating disorder or a sex and love addiction.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. For people that aren't familiar with the term process addiction, I was going to ask you to explain what some of those would be. So,
yeah, so gambling, shopping, these are behaviors that one becomes addicted to as coping mechanisms for coping with stress and difficult times.
And often if the child is too young to use alcohol or drugs, they're going to start with one of these.
Sure, absolutely.
To self-medicate, to handle the trauma. And what is the reason? Because I do believe everything in the body and the brain is ultimately geared towards healing. What is the purpose of PTSD, or what the brain does to try to kind of help us through something that's difficult?
Sure. So the physiological effects of a shocking incident are quite clear. A lot of people are starting to understand that we get mobilized into fight or flight. Okay. And then depending on whether we are able to overcome the threat that we mobilized for or not, we can get stuck in that state of fight or flight state. And then if we get overwhelmed in that state, in other words, we aren't able to deal with the threat, we can then move into a freeze state. They call it fawn and befriend or freeze. Those are sort of two different reactions, which is beyond the fight or flight. And once we get into that freeze state, it's kind of a pre-death state. It's the state an animal would go into if a predator like a lion or a leopard had caught the buck. It would go into the freeze state to numb out because it was about to be disemboweled while alive, right? So it shuts down all feeling, and that's a very common thing that addicts will talk about, is being numb, not being able to feel, being shut down, isolating, and not being able to connect. Okay, so the brain knows that the organism can't live in this state, and it has to come out of that state. Otherwise, the person is going to commit suicide, basically. The depression and all of that stuff is so much that the person will commit suicide. Or they use a behavior or a substance to get the hormones or the hormones that the body requires, either dopamine or whatever, oxytocin, to help you come out of that state, that pre-death state, into a connected state where one can, in actual fact, connect with other human beings, feel joy, etc., etc.
Now,
so it's actually a survival imperative, that coping mechanism. This is why Gabor Mate talks about the wisdom of trauma.
Yes.
Because it's a survival imperative. And in actual fact, those coping mechanisms are what got us to this point of surviving till we could actually figure it all out.
So in the place where you're in the frozen mode, yes, which is pre-death, like the brain, the body thinks, okay, I'm dying here, whether it's real death, disembowelment, or whether it is a parent abusing a child.
Absolutely.
Is a dissociative disorder a mechanism that kind of falls into that, where the brain can just check out?
Sure, absolutely.
And will you speak a little
Absolutely.
bit about depersonalization and dissociative disorder and how they're
Sure. So
kin?
yeah, that's a spectrum. Where on the one side you've got a daydreaming child, and on the other side you've got people who disassociate completely and create alters and that kind of thing. And there's a long spectrum of symptoms in between, such as an inability to concentrate. You know, the ADHD ADHD symptoms really are stress related.
Interesting.
Yeah. So and related to this inability to regulate back out of the stressed state into a rest and digest state, or a normal day-to-day state. Okay.
So on the milder, let's say, end of the spectrum is ADHD, inability to concentrate. And the far end of the spectrum is what we used to call multiple personality disorder.
Yes.
Now known as dissociative identity disorder.
That's it.
And then in between is zoning out, spacing out.
An inability to just and I experience this quite often, is an inability to settle to anything, and then sort of emotional flashbacks. And I don't know why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling, but I have strong feelings, and they are these emotional flashbacks that may have been triggered by something that's going on in my environment, or an interaction with somebody. And I cannot bring myself to my life because I'm stuck in this emotional flashback, and I need to check out to cope emotionally.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how would you work with somebody that comes to you that presents with, and some of the work you and I did really was around this issue, but how would you work with somebody that has complex post-traumatic stress disorder? What would you do? Like, what questions would you ask? And then how would you prepare them for healing?
So the first thing that I generally do is educate the person about their physiology, because in order to be able to learn sort of more healthy coping techniques and ways of doing things differently, one needs to understand one's physiology. Certainly it worked that way for me. When I could see, oh my gosh, this behavior is because I'm stuck in that place, and there are other ways to get me out of that place. It was much easier. It's part of that know thyself. The one commandment of any spiritual growth is know thyself, and in actual fact, it's also about know your body. Our mind body is connected, and so how we think affects our physiology, and how our physiology affects how we think. And an understanding of how that works is essential for somebody who is suffering from and trying to recover from. I don't want to say a disability, but in an understanding of the wisdom of trauma and the imperative, the survival imperative, I'm able to be so much more compassionate with myself. I'm not so hard on myself. And so that's where I start. is to help people understand their physiology and why their mind, why these things are happening to them. And then slowly through that, help them to learn how to be more compassionate with themselves. And in being more compassionate with themselves, which then allows them to start to learn different techniques, really.
So it's a process of educating, informing, and then retraining,
Yes,
sort of.
Absolutely. So creating new neural pathways, because
let's talk about that. I love neural pathways.
Yeah, absolutely, because we have these habits. I'll never forget the one description of this is or analogy is, you know, a seaside town, you know, and I suppose it won't translate across the country, but if we always go to for America, Maine for our holidays, and when we stress, that's where we go, we create this rat in our brain that says we're going to Maine. Oh, I'm stressed. Oh, I'm going to Maine, you know. And now we know that Maine is no longer good for us and we need to go to Florida instead. And it's very difficult to go to Florida because we don't know the way. We haven't figured out all the what we need to take to Florida. It's a completely different kind of place. And so the brain has to learn these new behaviors and create the road and what we do when we go there. And usually Florida is never as fun as what we might have done in Maine with, you know, with our coping mechanisms, our old coping mechanisms. But we know that that's a healthier place for us.
Well, Florida might end up being better, but getting there might not be as easy.
Well, there we go. Exactly. You got it.
So in the brain, and I learned about this from training my dog about neural pathways and interrupting the behavior that I didn't want and switching her attention and reinforcing that behavior and realizing this is really the work you do. I'm not saying it's like dog training, but basically we have that same, we used to call them back in my day, wrinkles in the brain. And I think now we know they're neural pathways.
Absolutely, Lisa, 100%. And so it's hard work as well, retraining the brain. And it's not work I can do as a coach. The person that I'm coaching has to do the work. But I can point them in the right direction and give them techniques on how to create new neural pathways, how to interrupt those old stories that take us down those old roads that we don't want to go down anymore, you know.
So you can give them a new map.
Sure, absolutely, very much so. And it's difficult because the brain's entire mission is to save energy. Okay, it uses a lot of energy, so it creates these pathways that don't take a lot of energy, and so when something happens, it runs through all its files quickly. Has anything like this ever happened before? Yes, this is what we do when this happens. Dish down the old road, you know. And to interrupt that behavior before we find ourselves standing in front of a dealer or in front of the fridge or whatever, is difficult. It requires brain energy. And then to say, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do this new thing, which uses a lot of brain energy, can be, that's what we talk about when it's emotionally tiring and draining to do this kind of work. Yeah.
Back to the dog training analogy. I had a trainer tell me 15 minutes of dog training is the equivalent of a 45-minute walk
Mm.
because of the engagement in the brain and the interrupting of these patterns. And it is like the path of least resistance is what you're saying. The brain's trying to save the energy, so it's going to go to what it knows.
Sure.
And
Sure. And there are always signs, the early warning signs that we've got to learn, which are different for each of us, that we have to learn about and pick them up earlier and earlier and interrupt the old story that we're telling ourselves, because it's usually a decision we've made about ourselves in childhood that we need to interrupt. And this is where the sort of inner child work and reparenting and inner family systems comes in, where we
well,
look at it.
so we have the beginning, we have the middle, which is the map. Would you share with us, obviously without using any names, because we don't want to, divulge confidentiality, but some of the miracles you've seen in doing this work in people's lives?
So, it's quite difficult to sort of put a finger on that kind of thing. What I would say is a miracle is when people stop, the people that I work with, when they stop being so hard on themselves and they start accepting themselves just the way they are. I would say that was the miracle of my healing journey, is coming to this point of not wishing anymore that it was different, of accepting that this is how I am, and I can live a fairly normal life with certain things in place to keep myself safe. I need enough sleep. I need to feed myself properly. I shouldn't spend too much time alone. And the reason for all of these things is that the minute that I'm hungry or tired or lonely, I'm stressed, and I go into my complex my complex PTSD responses to being stressed. So it's about learning lifestyles, it's about learning to interrupt narratives, and these things come in small increments, and I work with a range of people. So somebody who would say to me, sure, that loud voice in my head that tells me I'm such a terrible person is about 10% of what it used to be. That is a miracle.
Well, and I was going to say, having worked with you, I've experienced miracles in working with you. And one of the things I love that you do in your work is when I would say something, you would say, where is that in your body? Where are you feeling that in your body? And somehow that would get me more tied in to the reality of the feeling. And then we would work to get rid of that. Or not, I don't want to say get rid of it, but cope.
But learn to understand where it's coming from, I mean, one of my great miracles is one day on the phone with my mum, where she was asking me about my budget, realizing that my chest was getting tight, and I felt like I couldn't breathe, and being able to say to her, Mom, when you ask me about my budget, my chest gets tight and I feel like I can't breathe. So can we stop this conversation, please? What an absolute miracle, instead of just going off at her, blowing up, and then having that huge amount of remorse afterwards,
Yes, and that's one of the things I do love about that. And it also, in working with you, you taught me to trust my own intuition. That when someone's crossed my boundary, I know it now. It doesn't feel good. I may not know right off the bat what happened, but I know something isn't right in here. And working with you really helped me begin to manage that. I don't know if I'm ever going to be cured, or somebody with CPTSD will ever be cured, but we can certainly learn how to manage it.
Sure, absolutely. And there are ways of, the more we work with it, and the more we learn healthy coping skills, the less it affects our lives. And I think that you can talk about that. You can
Yes.
have, you have an experience of these old behaviors and old ways of relating to the world having changed.
Yes. Yes.
And that is a miracle, absolutely, to have let go of those old stories, and also to have learned, because it is this dissociation of going out of the body that you're talking about, where I would ask you, where is that in your body? Because the discomfort happens in the body, and then we flip out, just check out, because I can't be in relationship with the discomfort in my body. And the more that I practice remembering that if there's discomfort in the body, I need to pay attention to something that my inner child is not coping with.
Yes. And you do the inner child work as part of the working with the CPTSD.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Because I found that to be, I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. So when you talked about inner child work, I wanted to roll my eyes like, oh God, I don't want to do this again. But the way you approached it was so helpful. And that is one of the tools that I've been able to use to interrupt a negative neural pathway, is to really embrace and talk to my inner children, different ages. But that was one of the best, let me say, red lines on the roadmap you gave me.
Okay, sure. And I found it so useful as well, to separate out which part of me is feeling this way, which part of me is responding like this. Is kind of given me a spaciousness in my being, that there is actually this healthy adult who's grounded with her feet on the ground, and is responsible and knows what she's doing. And then sometimes she gets hijacked by the teenager or the inner child, or even by the that internalized critical parent. And to separate out which part of me that I've internalized is actually having this reaction has just given me, as I said, the spaciousness in my being to then be able to have a conversation of, okay, so what need was not met in each of these places, and how can I meet that need now, so that I can be fully responsible for myself emotionally?
Yes, the inner child work isn't a cop-out. It's a way to be a healthier adult.
That's it.
And I found it very, very useful. Well, Peta, anything else you want to tell us about CPTSD before we wrap up?
Lise, my my mind has gone quite blank. You've asked some lovely questions, and I do think that I suppose one of the things that I really do want to talk about and is the fact that I had very little memory of my childhood. Okay, I had odd memories that were a little bit difficult, and but I had no memory of the incidents, the early childhood incidents that actually really caused this CPTSD. And certainly, I mean, I tried to commit suicide when I was 19, and I've been in therapy all of my adult life basically since then, but there didn't appear to be a reason for my depression, for my suicidal thoughts, for my inability to cope with life, for any of that stuff. I appeared to come from this very perfect family, you know, and I just wasn't coping, you know, and I was trying to figure out what's wrong with me, because I come from this quite perfect family, and I should be able to. I mean, I dropped out of so many courses. I just couldn't seem to get my life on track. And it's only really recently, in the last 3 years, the memory started coming back about, certainly a cellular memory, just after my dad died. But in the last 6 years that I've actually had a conscious memory of what happened. But I've been working with the mother wound and trauma and stuff for a long time. And I think it's only really in the last 6 to 8 years that I came, oh my gosh, this is what happened. And we put this picture out to the world of this perfect family, but that wasn't what was going on. And I remember being in a meeting where I shared about my healing trauma and the work that I've done, and hearing somebody say, it's so amazing. I've had the same experience of not being able to understand why I can't cope with my life, and why I just seem not to be able to get anything done or get moving with my life. And now you've given me some words to talk with, you know, or to go and research. And I think that's something that a lot of people suffer from, is this early childhood trauma that isn't actually acknowledged as a trauma.
Right. Because people say, oh, it's so good, they're only 2 years old, they won't remember it, which is so unfair and untrue. And a lot of times we don't hear those stories growing up of the bad things that happened from 0 to 4 or 0 to 5.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then what you end up with is people who don't know why they're depressed, why they, and to a large degree, this is happening more and more and more because our lifestyle and the systems of our world are set up in a way that traumatizes people. And so we end up with this disconnected, people who are disconnected and don't know why. And there is this ongoing societal trauma, in fact, that isn't being addressed.
And so what I'm hearing you say, Peta, is you don't have to know necessarily what the trauma was to work through it and heal it.
Not necessarily.
Consciously.
No.
Like you can come in and think I'm screwed up and I don't know why I'm screwed up.
Absolutely. And sometimes it isn't useful to go and try and figure out why. You know,
right.
I have these symptoms, there must be some trauma somewhere, and let's work on different coping mechanisms, especially if somebody's just coming out, you know, into recovery. You wouldn't want to go and really dig in the childhood, but you learn the coping mechanisms and ways of staying clean and all of that kind of thing, and then later on. and learn about, yes, about the trauma response and all of that, because it helps to understand the addiction and the the propensity to return of symptoms and all of that stuff. But you wouldn't want to go and try and figure out why. The why is not a good question. That takes us back into the past.
Right.
And we need to stay firmly here and then move forward and learn ways of doing that.
I think this is a great way to express that it isn't necessary to know details. It's enough to say, I want to be more whole. And
Absolutely.
How can I do that?
100%, 100%. And when you said, but because the body's wise, I mean, when you can't remember, there's a reason why you can't remember. It's a survival mechanism, the disassociation is a survival mechanism. I couldn't cope with the situation as a child. I think my first addiction was fantasy. I lived in books because that was an easier place to be. And that was my disassociation. I could live in a story that was much happier place than the difficulty of my home life. And these, when people say, oh, she's just such a procrastinator, and she, there's a wisdom in why that child is behaving that way.
Right.
Instead of making them wrong, it's like, okay, what's actually going on here? Because these kinds of behaviors don't come from nowhere,
I interviewed a wonderful GP in South Africa who had a lot of knowledge of addiction and trauma. And we talked about children coming in with stomach aches. And 9 times out of 10, there was nothing wrong with their stomach, but something was going on in the family.
So, I mean, that's one of the symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder as well, is headaches, dizziness, stomach aches, and other psychosomatic manifestations in the body, because you can't talk about it. And the body holds. Bessel van der Kolk wrote that book called The Body Keeps the Score, is when the psyche can't cope, the body says, okay, I'll take that. And it gets held somewhere, and we develop chronic conditions. I have a sister who still suffers with migraines and nausea and dizziness when she's not coping.
And I think we've used psychosomatic to be kind of a bad word, but it's really not. It's like what you said, it's the wisdom of the body.
Sure, absolutely. I actually think all physical symptoms are psychosomatic.
Yeah, me too.
I would agree.
Me too. I think, energy is energy, and it just, if it's not expressed, it's going to show up somewhere in my body.
Yeah, and the mind, I mean, according to Buddhism, the mind pervades the body.
Yes.
It doesn't sit in the brain, or some people says the wisdom sits at the heart. It doesn't just sit in the brain or the heart. The energy channels go right through the body. I mean, I know I can feel energy coming out my fingers sometimes.
Right.
The energy channels go right through the body. So the mind pervades the body. And if the mind pervades the body, then they must affect each other.
Mm-hmm. And I used to suffer from tremendous headaches, tremendous. And it was usually when I was trying not to dissociate.
Sure.
It was the way that I learned to keep myself in my body. I would get these headaches where all I could think about was the headache. And,
sure.
I thank God today I am free of those headaches. But I remember wrapping rags around my head as tight as possible and banging my head against the wall, trying to get rid of these headaches. And then once I realized what was underneath it, then I began to be able to heal. So doing this work can really pay off. not just psychologically, emotionally, but if you've got physical ailments that nobody's been able to cure, I
Absolutely.
think doing this inner work and this trauma work is valuable.
Very. I found it absolutely invaluable. I mean, I used to have irritable bowel syndrome for years and years and years. It was debilitating. I no longer suffer from it. You know, these things are intimately linked to how we think, how the physiology of our body, of the polyvagal nerve that runs from brain to, I'm getting too technical, but
oh no, I love it. I love it. But you know, I'm thinking when I said, have you seen any miracles? You and I are two people who've experienced these miracles.
Sure, absolutely.
And I know you have a lot of clients who have experienced these miracles. And I've seen it in friends of mine. Being willing to do the work and being willing to look at that new map is half the battle.
Sure. Sure. And part of what makes the work scary is that we carry this thing from our childhood that we are not good enough. And I mean, that's such a you know, everybody feels not good enough, but that we are bad, terrible people, and we have to change ourselves to be acceptable. And then when this kind of work comes up, there's this fear that if I actually look at myself, I'm going to find this awful, terrible, terrible bad person, you know. And my experience, and certainly that of working with my clients, is that when we look, we find out we're not so bad. You know, there's this kids book called The Gruffalo, and I absolutely, you know, I read it to my kids, and this I think it is, this child is so scared of this Gruffalo and the shadow, because he sees the shadow of the Gruffalo and it's huge on the wall, you know, and when it's got teeth and when they actually turn around and look at the Gruffalo, it's this tiny little mouse that's just projecting this huge shadow onto the wall. And this is truly what this kind of work is about, that when we actually look, yeah, there's some stuff that I need to own, you know, I can be manipulative and all sorts of things. But when we actually do the work, it's a little mouse, you know, it's not nearly as bad as we thought it was, but we build it up in our minds, and this shadow and these things that we think we don't want to look at have grow in our the backs of our minds and in the bottoms of our hearts and our stomachs, where, you know, when the stomach sinks and I want to just hide myself in shame. And when I truly look, those things are not, number one, as shameful as I think they are. Most people go through them, but we don't talk about this stuff. We don't talk about it. And so people go through life thinking that they are the only one who experiences this kind of crazy or these sort of deep guilt and shame feelings. But when we get an opportunity to talk in a safe space, then we find out, you know, that this is a common human experience and it's not so bad, and it's actually part of the human condition.
Yes, and that healing it, feeling it, looking at it, I used to call it a green slimy monster inside of me that if anyone ever saw, they would hate me.
Sure.
And once I realized that wasn't there, that I was really actually quite lovable, and the more I became true and authentic in myself, the more lovable I was.
Absolutely.
I mean, more, at least to me, I got less where I cared about if I was lovable by anybody else. But the beauty of your work is really speaks for itself.
Thank you.
In that you're
Thank
very,
you. It was an absolute privilege to work with you.
thank you. You're a gifted healer, and you're also very skilled. And I have to say, and Peta's got great info on her website, because it talks about everything that you do, you know, not just the CPTSD, but just everything that you work with. Maybe we can talk another time about the mother wound.
Yeah, that would be great.
And what that's like, and healing that.
Absolutely. That would be lovely. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, Peta. It's been so lovely to talk to you again.